work I did when I was previously employed as a person working as a therapist. I worked with a lot of cases that caused me a lot of anxieties and created situations which I had to resolve. And the only way I could do that were either by writing, by the books that I did, or possibly the paintings. So painting, in a sense, is a kind of solace to my life of the things that I did in my past. Not that there's anything I regret. And I'm using that as a catalyst to resolve things which in fact, they're unresolvable. Initially, I started painting when I was very young, but as life progressed, of course, things got in the way. You have a family and so on, you have to make a living. I found that I could always link the two together. For example, having to work and the work that I was doing, and also having the ability to make sufficient money for me to be able to live without having to worry too much. I started an art gallery a long time ago now in London. The advantage I had was that I could collect using the money I was earning, and of course I could paint. So the advantage in that is that you've got two options in that you could look at the paintings by Chagall, Matisse, and Picasso and so on. And also I could collect sufficient things that I liked without having to worry about the financial problem. Of course, that gives you a greater option. If you have the ability to have these beautiful things, looking at them inspires you to paint, and that's the reason why I started painting. Of course, the later paintings are completely different because I'm not looking at inspiration from other artists. I'm trying to find a way to express my emotional response to the art I make. In the last 15 years, I've been incredibly prolific. I spent every day painting, usually from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and I paint a portrait. So you divide that into 365, take the weekend off, you multiply that by 10, and you have 3,850. I have no idea, something like that. I've done a lot of very good work, and I feel my work that I'm doing now with my charity work, I find gives me solace because it's in a way paying back for things that I would like to have resolved. Some issues which are unresolvable come out by me painting them and remembering the story. From 65 onwards, I started looking at ways in which to express myself emotionally. You know, we are, by nature, we are intrinsically creative. That's what we do. And the expressions and ways that we can do that is, of course, manifold. And one of the things I found, however insecure you are about your own true north, as they say, is to find a vehicle. And the vehicle that I found which works for me is painting. My initial thing was to try and find a way to avoid being an academic. But what I found was your search for meaning leads you to all sorts of paths. So when I finished my school, I went to a university, which is Witwatersrand, which at the time in South Africa was part of a huge technical thing. So I did a year of that, then eventually went to Paris to go study the Sorbonne. Then I went to do my next phase of my life was in Amsterdam, 1968. And I had the advantage of being able to work in a company called the Accepta Medica, which is now Elsevier, like a medical research company. And what the ability was then was to have access to anything that was controversial at the time, how to resolve issues based on all sorts of assumptions. You have to remember this is a long, long time ago. So a lot of the academia, the work that I did was effectively based on the research that had been done through Accepta Medica. Working in clinics, I realized that my issue was not related to the academia, but the perception of the sicknesses that I worked with and the illnesses that I worked with. PTSD is a good example, or postnatal depression. And most of the time, OCD and so on, when you have a situation which you immerse yourself in by the belief system, and the belief system is something that you perceive yourself to have, depression is a good example, your perception of the situation, the idea of being depressed is often more complex than the issue itself. So how do you know you have depression, for example? People follow a pattern, but depression is a word, like suicide is just a word. So my interest was changing the perception that people have of their illnesses based on the therapy that I was doing. And my interest is essentially through a man called Joseph Volpe, who was really interested in what's called immersion therapy, and that's confronting an issue that you have an option about and how to resolve it by confronting it. There's some controversial issues related to that, like, for example, you shouldn't swim when you don't know how, but you essentially could survive if you jump in, because we are by nature people that survive. But my interest is essentially, your therapy is essentially your own therapy. It's how to resolve your own deep-seated emotional issues. And I think that's what I'm doing at the moment with my paintings and my books. When I lived in Lama, I lived in a house near the sea, and I was then starting to do research in a particular thing which is called prosopagnosia. It's a very boring subject, but it's something related to how the brain functions under stress. The first book I did was called Glass Facade, Past Lives, and that was essentially to do with expressions that people have through emotional remorse, regrets and so on. And I found that I could look at faces and try and find ways in which to read what it is that they were saying and how to translate that. So I'd write the story, and then I would put the painting of the story and then write the story of the painting. For example, a woman who was a translator, and exceptionally clever, had this breakdown of this particular thing where she couldn't recognize her husband and where she became manic in a sense. And this is really to do with prosopagnosia. And then because I painted what she looked like, I tried to relate the story into that, and that's how it came about. So the first faces that I started painting was to do with the first book I did. When you're dreaming late at night or whatever, you try and find a reason for the things that you make. I've had this puzzle why the eyes are so telling. And sometimes when I look at a painting which I finished and I go away and I sleep for the night, come back the next day, I realize that the eyes are so emotional. They're very simple to make, they're just a few dots really. So sometimes I get quite affected by the paintings because I wonder whether or not it's my emotional state or there's something to do with a trigger from the past. And I think I'm fairly level-headed, but some things affect you subconsciously, shall we say. You don't realize that. A bit of guilt and fear and anxiety, all these things. But it depends on your level. Your perspective is related to your assumption of the situation. Well, there are two ways that people see my work. Most of the people see them as superficial because they're just faces. I mean, they're not there to make a diagnosis or prognosis of the paintings. They take a photograph which dissipates the thing. It's a bit like putting MSG in food. It's no point. You're just filling the thing up. And I'm not really interested in the people who come superficially taking a photograph of my stuff. That's not my interest at all. I'm past the point in which I'm looking for fame or fortune. I'm looking for essence, substance. Some of the people that I've had who fortunately for me have collected my work now for some time have had an extraordinary response. The response was really about living through the paintings that have been things that I did in my past, which they live in the future, and they tell me about it. When you have the art fairs, I met a woman who had a small child. She was, I think, a Korean lady. Her English wasn't very good, but she looked at one of my portraits and she sobbed uncontrollably. Now, in an art fair, there are thousands of people around, and people are not there to regurgitate their emotions, so they're there to take photographs or whatever. And in a way, what became a problem for me is to help this woman by making her feel better. I wanted to find out. So somebody by chance came along who spoke Korean. She had lost her husband in a horseback riding accident. She had a small child, and her life was totally dependent on her husband to the point where they had escaped from North America. And she had been put in a situation where she was confronting her own demons, her own past. And she said what she saw was the total history of her past in a fleeting 20 minutes. The child was the most extraordinary thing. So I made a portrait of the child later on because the child was absolutely unmoved and stoic. She didn't cry, no emotions. And I wondered, she's 6 years of age, and I wonder what happened. How did she see things? And I wish I could just spend the time. Anyway, I made a painting, which I find most intriguing because it's very round and it had unemotional response. It was just really to do by shape and color. That's the one I found the most meaning in. I'm often accused of making the paintings too crude because I don't want people to buy them. People say that to me. I don't know because people, of course, buy the paintings. My intention is to express the emotion that the painting conveys rather than the technique that the painting is about. And that's what matters. So the cruder, the better. I don't care about the color or the stick, whatever. For me, it's the making of. But I would paint by making the crudest painting and leaving the paint open so they can dry up and I can scoop a bit out. My brushes are really not in good shape, and I often think, if you look at Francis Bacon, not that I'm comparing myself, but he painted in a very crude way by making wonderful things with limited materials. I'm not too bothered by people telling me it's good, bad, or indifferent. I want them to just respond to them emotionally. That's fine. I would prefer to think it's technically not very good. But the question is, could I make them better by having better material? Well, you can probably cook better if you have cooked better ingredients. They say in Italy you can go to a service station and it's a rubbish place, and they can make a beautiful pasta with 3 ingredients. Or you could go somewhere with a restaurant who makes terrible food, inedible, for a large amount of money. Which food is better? Well, the one that's cheaper because it's made with passion. For me, I'm just interested in making things that I want to put it onto canvas or paper or whatever it is, quickly as possible, and that's the end of the story, and get on to the next one. But my purpose is not to make the paintings that they have value. I don't mean value in the material sense, but I suspect a lot of people will get pleasure from the paintings that I've made and have a link to their past as a consequence. That's how I see them.